Welcome back to Third Shift Hobbies. Today we're going to discuss installing a DCC decoder in any locomotive. In front of us here we have this old Athearn Blue Box GP35, and we've decided that we're going to install a TCS Cat22 decoder in this locomotive. In this video we're going to discuss how we arrived at the TCS Cat22 to be the right decoder for this locomotive, and also tips and tricks on installing a decoder so that your engines run at their optimum performance. Also, we're going to go over schematics and how not to get hung up on schematics by understanding the standards of how locomotives are wired. Now, the first thing we need to touch on is DCC ready. DCC ready is kind of an odd term because it means different things to different manufacturers. And a lot of people get hung up on the thought that it has to say DCC ready on the package to be able to install DCC in that locomotive. Not true. As long as the electric motor that's inside of the locomotive can be isolated from the track power, you can install DCC in any locomotive. Now, some of the more common DCC ready applications are with 8-pin and 9-pin plugs. Here we have a Proto 2000 SD7 that is a DCC ready locomotive with an 8-pin plug. As you can see, the decoder is located right here. You can pull the decoder straight out of the locomotive. When you pull this out of the package, there's a dummy plug in that socket. You pull the dummy plug out, you take the decoder, place it in the 8-pin plug, you're ready to go. It's DCC. Another common one are if you have any Athearn RTR engines, this board may look familiar to you. There's also a 9-pin socket here for 9-pin decoders. You would remove this dummy plug and take your decoder and slide it on, and there you go, you're ready to go. It's now DCC equipped. The nice thing about the 9-pins, they have a key here. You cannot put this decoder in the wrong way. It will only fit one direction. 8-pins, on the other hand, as is the case with this Proto engine, they can be installed backwards. Now, if you happen to put one of these in backwards, you won't mess anything up. The locomotive will just run in reverse. The next thing we need to touch on is determining the right decoder for your locomotive. The most important thing in trying to determine which decoder will work for your locomotive is, will the decoder fit in the locomotive? Now, there are a lot of decoders on the market that are direct fit decoders that replace light boards that are installed in the locomotives from the factory. And that may or may not be the right choice for the particular locomotive you're working on, depending on the features that you want. Does the decoder have superior motor control? Does it have enough lighting functions that you want? You may want strobes and ditch lights, and of course headlight and tail light, and maybe any number of other lighting features on your locomotive. That's also an important thing to consider. And usually additional lighting functions are available on a decoder in the same size package. In addition to the total number of functions a decoder can control, another thing to take into considerations is how can those functions be programmed? What will they support? Will they support ditch lights? Will they support a Mars light? Will they support a strobe? How are the headlight and rear light functions controlled? Are they purely directional? Will one dim in the opposite direction? Can you set another function key to dim the headlights entirely on both ends? A great resource to evaluate just about every decoder on the market is to download JMRI software to your computer. It's free software, and I suggest making a donation to those that wrote it because it is a valuable resource for those of us that have DCC systems. Even if you don't have your system set up for computer control, JMRI would be a great resource to help you evaluate decoders to determine which one would work best for you. Now let's talk a bit about motor control. As we stated earlier, the decoder we're going to install in this particular locomotive is a TCS Cat22. And I'd like to touch on how I arrived at installing the TCS Cat22 inside this locomotive. Now if we remove the shell, we'll see that this is just an old Athearn blue box locomotive. Now with this locomotive, I'm estimating that it is probably about 40 years old, considering the metal truck side frames, the lack of flywheels, and some other things. It's kind of hard to date Athearn engines, but this one's got some age to it. Now, we did test this on a DC track, and the thing runs like a top. It's an excellent running locomotive. Now, notice the lack of flywheels. Now, some may say, why don't you just replace that with a new motor with flywheels already on it? Well, that can be a bit of a pain, just because the newer motors have a hex drive on the end of the flywheel itself. And you have to change the drive shafts, and you have to change this coupling here that the drive shaft would attach to. And it would probably be beneficial to use some super glue to make sure that you don't spin those couplings on the shaft, which, mindful being careful not to get it into the bearing and seizing up your worm gear inside the truck, which kind of leads me to the conclusion that we don't want to change that. And you're probably asking, why are we talking about flywheels when we're discussing decoders? Well, to determine the type of decoder that you want to use in a locomotive, this does have some merit. We need to talk a little bit about what flywheels do. Flywheels tend to smooth out the operation of the locomotive. Now, if we use a decoder that has superior motor control, those vibrations and inconsistencies can virtually be eliminated. The other thing that flywheels do is when you hit a dead spot in the track, they can help the motor coast past that dead spot so that you don't end up with jerky operation. Hence how we arrived at the TCS Cat22. The TCS Cat22 has a built-in keep alive, extra capacitors, that will allow the locomotive to operate on dead track for approximately 10 seconds, virtually eliminating all of those problems that the lack of flywheels have. Now also, TCS has about the best motor control of any of the digital decoders available. So this thing will run even better. It's already a fine running locomotive, but we can improve it by installing this particular decoder. Now that we have determined the type of decoder that we want to use in this locomotive, I want to briefly touch on some of the tools that you would need to install a decoder in a locomotive. Now remember, if you have any questions up to this point, feel free to leave us a comment down below or send us an email if you need a faster response. The first thing that we want to look at here that you would probably need is a good set of wire strippers. These will come in very handy for stripping very small wire. And if you're saying to yourself, well, where do I get a pair of those like that? Well, I just happen to know exactly where you could probably get a pair of those. Just check out our website. Also, another thing that might come in handy would be a digital multimeter with a continuity tester. It'll help you figure out what wires go where. And we'll get into that here shortly. Set that aside. Also, the other thing that you would probably need is a good soldering iron. Now this one's a temperature controlled soldering iron. We do these professionally, so it's probably for the average hobbyist, not cost effective to purchase something like this, but a simple 15-20 watt pencil iron would be more than sufficient. Just be sure to get something with a really small tip, because you're going to be soldering some pretty fine stuff. Another thing that would probably be good to have would be one of these vices. Has alligator clips. You can hold wires together while you're soldering, because nothing's more difficult than trying to solder something that's moving around all the time. Another thing would be heat shrink tubing. I buy it in a gigantic roll because I do use quite a bit of it. If you do need it, we sell it in smaller quantities. And here we get to tape. Here we have tape. This is your enemy. Don't use this. These decoders are small computers. They're very sensitive to heat. If you install a decoder and try to tie it down with electrical tape, chances are it's going to overheat and fail on you. Not a good thing to have happen. So we do use some of this. Let me bring this locomotive back over here. Like for instance, under here we would want to insulate, because the motor makes a connection with the frame. We want to make sure it's isolated. We would most likely use electrical tape underneath the motor to help insulate the connection. That's about the only place we use it. This is Kapton tape. Kind of expensive, but about the best thing you can use to strap down decoders, insulate motors, whatever you can think of inside a locomotive. This is probably about one of the best things you can use. Now, we do carry this. Now keep in mind, you may have looked at this stuff on the internet and said, wow, that's expensive. Well, this roll I've had for probably 3 years, and there's still a whole bunch left. Now keep in mind, we install decoders professionally, so we do a lot of them. This will last you a long time. And double-sided tape. Don't use double-sided tape to hold down your decoder, unless you absolutely have to. Once again, with heat, this doesn't allow heat to pass through it, and it can cause your decoders to overheat and fail. Now, if you do find that you have to use it, we use it to tie down speakers and some other different things. Be sure to buy the gray outdoor type. If you use the white indoor type, it can disintegrate on you and leave a white residue, crumbly residue all over the place. Not a good thing to get in your electric motors inside your locomotives. Now that we've talked about the tools and materials that you need to install a decoder, now we need to talk about where the wires go. Now, when you purchase your decoder, most of the time they come with a schematic. Now, the schematic is usually pretty generic. It tells you the colors of the wires and where they connect, but it doesn't really give you enough information to do the job properly. So we'll just set that aside for now. Now, to determine where the wires go, the four most important wires are the motor connections and the track connections. So to determine that, we're going to go back to the old DC world and look at a standard that the NMRA put in place many, many years ago, which basically says if you apply positive voltage to the engineer side of the locomotive, it will travel forward. That's going to help us out a lot here. Now, the engineer always sits on the right side, the right-hand drive, just like a car in the UK. So, this being the front, the engineer's going to sit here, you apply positive voltage to this side, it's going to travel in this direction. Now, for the high hood guys out there, and I know there's several of them, they're going to say, well, N and W and Southern, they always ran them along hood forward. Well, for the purpose of installing a decoder, we're going to consider this to be the front. Once we get the decoder installed, we can actually program it to run in the opposite direction so that traveling in this direction would be forward. Now, going back to what we were talking about applying positive voltage to this side, our wires on our decoder correspond with that. Now, there are 4 wires here that are important. You have a red wire, orange wire, gray wire, and a black wire. The red and black are your track connections. Red meaning the positive, and black being the negative, which is pretty standard. So, going back to the NMRA standard, we know that if we apply positive voltage to the engineer side of the locomotive, it will travel forward. that makes this red wire your positive connection. Your orange wire is your positive motor wire. Your black wire is your negative, which connects to the opposite rail of this one. And the gray wire is your negative motor wire, which connects opposite the orange wire. So using what we know about the NMRA standard, we can look at any locomotive. And also, even if you can't tell, we've got a blue box here, old Atherton blue box, just for simplicity. It's easy to tell where the connections are in one of these. Now, just in case, this is where your continuity tester would come in handy to determine where those connections are. Now, on this particular unit, we know that if we apply positive voltage to this side, that's why we set the shell on and then took it back off, that the locomotive will travel forward. So this is where we want to hook our positive wire. By looking at this locomotive, we can see that these metal arms coming up off the trucks are both tied to this rail, just by looking at it. And if you can't tell, once again, you can use your meter to check it out. So typically, since this is where your positive voltage would go when the locomotive is traveling forward, that would be where you would attach your red wire. Now your black wire would attach to the chassis, because the chassis picks up from the other rail. Now for your motor connections, your orange wire is your positive motor connection. You can see that Atherton and some others always have this metal strip that runs from these truck arms to the top of the motor. Now, when we do this, we will always remove this because we want to isolate the motor from the track power. And once again, we would take this motor out, put electrical tape underneath it to isolate it so that we don't, because you can short out and blow up a decoder if you're not real careful about isolating the motor. So again, your red wire goes to the right rail, which would be right here. Your orange wire, also positive, goes to the motor. It would connect right here, which leaves these two. The gray is your motor negative. It would attach down here to the bottom of the motor, or the other motor tab. And black, which is your left rail, would attach here to the frame. So it's pretty easy to tell once you understand the NMRA standard and what these four wires do. You can look at any locomotive and figure out how those wires get installed in that locomotive. And if you can't tell by visually looking, just use your multimeter, and you'll be able, with your continuity tester, and you'll be able to probe around, put one on the wheel on the right rail and probe around in there and see just exactly where it makes a connection. Now for lights, all the rest of your wires on your decoder are your function wires. This happens to be a 2-function decoder, so this purple wire and green wire are just extra. They don't really matter. White is your headlight, yellow is your rear light, and blue is the common. It would wire to both lights. So wiring a decoder really isn't that complicated. Now for wiring lights, here's a really nice diagram that comes from TCS website. And you can look this up, download it, and print it off. I refer to it really often. You can, if you know the voltage of your LEDs or bulbs, depending on what you want to use, and it's also broken down by the number of them. If you know the voltage of your track up here at the top, it will tell you what resistor you should use in this chart for that particular light diagram. And also here, they give you some idea of how to hook up an LED, where the blue wire is your positive, your function wire would be whatever other color you were using, white for headlight, yellow for rear light. The resistor goes on that side. Also, they show that usually on a standard LED, one lead is longer than the other, which they diagram that as well. But also you can see inside the LED, there's a flag and then a shorter piece. So if you look at an LED, and you probably can't see it on the camera, the inside of this LED looks exactly like this diagram. That's a big help. It's definitely worth downloading and printing off from TCS website. Now that we've examined where the wires go in a locomotive, hopefully that will help you understand more about how to install a decoder and might take some of the mystery out of it. Now we need to look at some installations that have been done previously. I want to show you a few examples here. And kind of the last thing, but definitely one of the most important thing we can touch on here is neatness counts. A locomotive that has a neat installation will always perform better than one that does not. You notice this is one we just did recently using a TCS decoder. Excellent motor control, but we've used heat shrink tubing to loom the wires up. We've used some connectors that slide on in case the trucks ever have to be taken off for maintenance. You don't have to unsolder any connections, but everything's nice and neat and organized, and the shell will slip right on without any issues. Here's the exact same locomotive, same model of locomotive with a different installation, and you can just kind of see that number one, it doesn't look very neat, but secondly, you've got stuff touching the flywheels and rubbing, and this is kind of the headlight LEDs kind of flopping all over the place, and you got to be careful when you put the shell on that you're not pinching wires, and it kind of gets to be a bit of a pain when you're trying to service your locomotives that things just don't fit the way they should. Here's another switcher, a proto that somebody else installed that we're going to redo. It doesn't run very well because when you put the shell on it, the wires rub against the drivetrain back here in the rear, and it causes it to become sluggish, and it's creating extra strain on the motor. We're going to redo this one so that it looks more like the first locomotive that you looked at, so that it's nice and neat, and the shell will actually fit on the locomotive without having wires hanging out and binding up against the drivetrain and those other miscellaneous things. So just remember, neatness counts. Definitely. This locomotive here will, if your installation looks like this, your locomotive will service you for a long time. Well, I hope we've cleared up some things here. Now we will be doing another video showing the installation of the decoder in this locomotive. Not necessarily the step-by-step, but the post-decoder install, and show you how it runs and that. Just kind of a little overview. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's cleared up a lot of things about installing a decoder. And I hope now everyone realizes that as long as the motor can be isolated from the track power, you can install DCC in any locomotive. Again, thank you for watching. Please check out our website at thirdshifthobbies.com. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below, or if you need a faster response, send us an email. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.